Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. Where can you get the best medical information anytime and anywhere? I think right here on the smartest doctor in the room. I'm your host, Dr. Dean Mitchell. The connection between diet and cancer has been, in some ways, the holy grail of medicine. Elusive and yet tantalizing just to think that our diet can influence our risk for cancer and maybe even reverse it. I think many of you would be surprised to know that a lot of current data showing our diet can affect cancer is not new. In fact, in Nazi Germany, where they were exterminating Jews, gays, and other non-Aryans, cancer was on the rise, and German scientists, who were the leading researchers in the world at the time, were especially focused on the connection between diet and cancer. Even more fascinating was Hitler's fear of cancer. Hitler's mother died in his teens from cancer, and it forever changed him. Ironically, the scientist in Germany who was considered the world's leading cancer researcher at the time was Jewish and openly gay. His name was Dr. Otto Warburg. What a conundrum for Hitler. Does he rid Germany of this eminent scientist who he must personally abhor, or does he allow him to pursue his research? Well, we're going to find out when we discuss in today's podcast. My guest today is Sam Apple. Sam is a science writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, and his book, Ravenous, The Nazis and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection, is what we will be discussing today. I read this book several months ago. I couldn't put it down, and I did a second swing through the last few days to go prepare for the podcast. So I'm really excited to speak to the author himself, Mr. Sam Apple. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
Okay. So you are on the faculty. You're at the Johns Hopkins Science Writing Lab. I saw that on your bio. I'm just curious. I have like the writer in me too. I've written a book, not as popular as yours, but I was wondering how you got interested in science writing, let's say versus fiction or biographies, because as someone, as a doctor, I know science writing is not easy. I mean, you really, besides obviously being a good writer, you have to know the technicalities to make the subject, veritable and yet at the same time, digestible. So anyway, how'd you get into science writing?
So it's a good question. I was originally a general nonfiction writer. I never thought of myself as a science writer. I was always interested in science, but I didn't take that many science classes as an undergraduate, and never really thought I would go into science writing. But I was always curious about my health, and became particularly interested in part because my mother had MS, and I didn't know. I was told it wasn't genetic, but then I started to wonder as I became an adult, well, if it's not genetic, are there environmental factors? So some of these were just, natural personal questions. But over the years, I became particularly interested in nutrition, my metabolic health. I remember my doctor telling me that I had high triglycerides and thinking I really have no idea what that means, or the fact didn't seem that concerned. So I just kind of let it go. But definitely a turning point for me was encountering the work of Gary Taubes, who is a well-known science journalist who writes about low-carb nutrition.
That's right.
Recently, the 20th anniversary of his sort of famous article in the New York Times Magazine about, challenging kind of the low-fat dogma. And that really blew me away because it was so contrary to everything I had learned. And, it just raised a lot of questions for me. And, I'm not sure that at the early stages of my career, I was ready to be a science journalist. But as I grew into it, I started to like it more and more, in part because, I think I'm first and foremost a storyteller. And I feel like science journalism, there's always stories embedded. I don't have to go looking for the stories. There's the story of the scientist making the discovery. There's this story.
It's so interesting you make that point, and I think that I guess I'm sure you're teaching writers, but I've talked about this on other podcasts. Honestly, doctors and even honestly chemistry professors. They made, when I went to undergraduate at Brown, the undergraduate science courses were usually painful. They were boring. It was really kind of hard to get excited about it. And when I look back, I did have one or two really outstanding teachers, but they typically would give you the history, because again, when you just study something, just for our listeners, like some biochemistry or chemistry, when it's very isolated, it's just boring stuff. But the way you can make it come alive is to give the history and the story. And as many scientists will say, they stand on the shoulders of other previous scientists. I mean, you don't just come up with some theory out of the blue. It's like you either have to dispel what was before you or you build on what came before you. And but a really good story will do that. And people say that frequently, honestly, about uh, Watson. I'm blanking on his first name.
James Watson.
James Watson. Thank you. Right, like James Watson. Again, I think it was the book, The Double Helix.
Yeah.
And a lot. I think it was. I have it up here too. It was Jennifer Doudna, who just got the Nobel Prize for CRISPR, talks about how that book was on her bed. Her dad gave it to her, and it just because Watson wrote in a very apparently exciting way about science, and that can get people excited. The same way a good scientist really again makes it interesting, like a mystery, not just some boring stuff. Otherwise, who wants to do it? So
Yeah. Yeah. And even when, Watson and Crick first made their discovery, it wasn't immediately a world-changing thing. It was sort of
right,
as the story, people sort of understood the narrative more and how important it was, that it really became
yeah.
a sensation.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, let's get to the focus. The way I really want to do this in two parts. There's such fascinating history in your book, Ravenous, and then we're going to get into, because I know a lot of the listeners want to know more about diet and cancer, but I want to set the background first for our listeners. Picture it's the 1930s, and Hitler is rising to power in Germany that has been beaten down from World War One reparations. I mean, their economy was in ruins due to hyperinflation. It was sort of the perfect storm for an autocrat to rise to power and put fear in people and find a scapegoat for all their problems. Um, Kind of sounds a little familiar. Hitler also realizes he needs more natural resources to avoid food shortages in the future. Hence, invading other countries becomes, you know, foremost in his mind. But as the Nazis gained power in Germany, many Jews, including some of the most eminent scientists in the world at that time, began fleeing Germany for other countries, and a lot of them came to the United States, fortunately. Um, So my question is, historians and are fascinated by Hitler. Unfortunately, it's like how could somebody be that evil? How could somebody captivate a country? And in the book, you really capture a lot what he was like. So I was just curious again, how did you find out this information about him? I can a lot of things. I never knew that he was so fearful about cancer. I didn't, all these little things. Was this just from gleaning your research? I mean, was there any firsthand accounts of anybody that knew him personally? Just curious.
Yeah, yeah, it was interesting. I never, there is sort of a small Hitler biography sort of embedded within the book, and I never planned to write that. But I was, of course, interested in the Nazis and cancer. And if you're interested in that question, you have to look at what Hitler thought about cancer. And I was really struck by the story of Hitler and his mother, Clara Hitler. Um, she's dying of breast cancer, and he's a teenager. I think she's first diagnosed when he was about 16, 17, and he eventually goes away, has, these failures at becoming an artist in Vienna, comes back home, and his mother's dying, and she's being treated by a Jewish doctor, of all things. And
That I thought was fascinating. Like as you
yeah,
said, I think the doctor made house calls every day for like 42 days.
yeah,
So you.
yeah, no, he was an incredible doctor, and Hitler liked him, and they were side by side every day for months, and Hitler encouraged him, to try, to do anything he could.
Mm.
And then, Hitler later actually allowed him to, in 1938, to escape Austria, and, essentially, personally protected him. Uh, so I don't think he blamed the, some people have hypothesized that maybe he blamed this Jewish doctor for his mother's death, and that's why.
Mm.
I don't think that was the case, but what's really striking is, the doctor later published an account of Hitler, and
Oh, the
you know,
doctor did. He
yeah,
he. Interesting. Okay.
yeah, and he said in his entire life he had never encountered somebody more. I think the word he used in translation was forlorn, more depressed than
Mm.
Hitler was by his mother's side. When he came in the morning when his mother died, Hitler was sitting by his mother's bedside. And he carried a picture with her of her for the rest of his life. But what's interesting is that historians have looked at this and talked about it. That it's probably the only person who was ever capable of loving. There was a human in there somewhere, but he would essentially have these transformations from Hitler the human to Hitler the monster, if you will. And so it was clearly a very fundamental part of his psyche. And then for the rest of his life, he worried about other diseases. He was a hypochondriac more generally, but he was always focused on cancer first and foremost. And many of the other Nazis were as well, but Hitler to a strange extent. He had a polyp in his throat at one point, and that set him off. But he was always talking about it and always, asking about, what's the latest research. So a lot of it was quackery, but he was also, of course, interested in the actual science as well, to the extent that he thought it could help. So I was really fascinated by that angle.
Yeah, it is kind of fascinating when you think about it too. This person who presents this cold-blooded, um, like you think doesn't have a heart, is obviously, incredibly insecure and frightened, of his own mortality, as he was busy taking millions of people's mortality.
Yeah,
Other thing you bring up in the book, which I thought was very interesting, was that there was data from Germany, and it was actually coming from the most strangest place. It wasn't from medical researchers. It was from actually an insurance actuary, Frederick Hoffman, who was showing data that cancer rates were rising, I guess, after the turn of the century, and obviously in Germany and other modern societies. So was this also becoming like a big, like as you were saying, a big concern for the Third Reich, and that cancer was on the rise, that they had to do something?
yeah. It really started in the second half of the 19th century, and in a way, I think of that is the true story of the book. I tried to weave various stories,
Mm.
but the true story, the deeper story, really is why cancer started to rise, how it continued to rise, and did we miss something? And maybe we'll get to that later.
Yes, yeah, you are leading me into that. So, yeah, so that was interesting. And I think that the listeners should be aware of that. So let's get back to Otto Warburg, okay? On a couple of different angles. Why was he different? Why, when all of these Jewish scientists, because again, I think he was half Jewish, but he knew he was in danger, and he was also gay, and that also put him in another, openly gay, and that was also another huge risk to to the Nazis. Why do you think he stayed in Germany? I know you explained a little bit of the book, but I'd like to hear
Yeah,
your take on it. And yeah, and also just your perception. Also, he was seeing a lot of horrors around him. He saw colleagues losing their positions at universities. Obviously, some of them could be getting killed. Why was he in his own vacuum, in his own world, or is he thought he was above it? What was your take?
yeah,
Why he stayed?
yeah. I thought about that question a lot, as I was writing, and I think a few different things contributed to it, but I think the most fundamental issue was his ego. As I talk a lot about in the book, he was just an extraordinarily arrogant human being.
Mm.
A lot of it was justified, in fairness, because he was a genius. But even so, one scientist said on a scale of 1 to 10 of arrogance, Warburg rated at 20. I think people saw him. But this is really interesting to me. I didn't understand this until I started to dig in a little more. But when the Jews were fleeing Germany, a lot of scientists in the early 30s, it was considered a humiliating thing. Now we look back at it and think, oh, what foresight, what wisdom, what
Yes, right.
bravery. But at the time, it was like acknowledging your second class citizenship. Like, we're not worthy and we're leaving the way. So Fritz Haber, was devastated, humiliated when he left, died shortly thereafter. And Warburg, in that understanding, in that context, it would have been impossible for Warburg to leave. He could not accept any kind of humiliation, any kind of
Yeah.
public embarrassment. And, in addition to that, just a couple of years earlier, 1931, he wins the Nobel Prize.
Right.
Rockefeller Institute, gives him this extraordinary institute. So he's in the best position of really any scientist in the world. He has everything he wants, a team of
Right.
technicians to do all of his experiments. So, it was a hard thing to give up.
Yeah, when I read into it also, it's also he had this incredible pedigree. I mean, his dad won the Nobel Prize in physics. The family was friends with other Nobel Prize winners, Emil Fischer, the world-renowned chemist. I mean, Einstein, was again a family friend. So yeah, I got the sense that this was a person that very comfortable in what he had achieved, and again, it's very hard to, I've known over the years, doctors that have fled countries where there was issues, whether it was South Africa or South America. It's very difficult to pick up and leave the language, the country where you've
Yeah,
grown up with, and it's very, very hard. I mean, but obviously, for so many of the Jews, there was no
yeah,
decision. It was life or death.
yeah. Warburg
So
Warburg once said that, for another scientist, it was possible because you can get a lab anywhere. But he said for a king, you can't just find a new kingdom.
yes, right. That sums it up, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah.
Right.
And Einstein had a great quote too. He said, some people couldn't leave Germany because, the German Jews had loved and supported Germany and fought in World War I. He said to leave in 1933, you had to admit you were wrong about Germany. Warburg couldn't admit he was wrong about anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing too. Einstein had already won a Nobel Prize, and I think he lost his position. I mean, see that I think that for our listeners, that brings out the huge thing is that, and we're going to get into this. Warburg doing his cancer research was again so important to Hitler. I mean, whereas Einstein, again, with his amazing, brilliance, probably they didn't see the importance of physics, and his theories of relativity to their immediate benefit. So I believe he lost his position at the university where he was teaching, and Warburg just went on, with his institute untouched.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah. I mean, Einstein sort of separated himself before the Germans had a chance. They sort of kicked him out after he had already announced that he didn't want any part of it.
oh, is
And
that
I
right? Mm-hmm.
really came away thinking of Einstein not only, of course, a genius, but also kind of a political genius. Like he saw what was coming well before everybody else. Yeah, just a
Mm,
brilliant human being.
yeah. If you could explain the best that you can for our listeners, what did actually Warburg win the Nobel Prize in medicine and physiology for? Because it didn't have to do with cancer. It was with,
Yeah, it was peripherally, related to his cancer research, but it wasn't actually, the cancer research. He won really for figuring out or making a critical discovery in terms of understanding how a cell breathes. Once we take in oxygen, we take in glucose, they have to burn, not unlike a fire burns. They have to react, and nobody knew exactly. They were starting to figure out the steps, how the glucose is broken down, how it's reaches oxygen, and the study of enzymes was entirely new. They had very, by today's standards, very primitive technology. So Warburg sort of unraveled this final step of the process. How the molecules that we eat are broken down and react with oxygen at one specific enzyme, and that sort of put the respiration story together. In the introduction to his Nobel Prize speech, I like how it was put. They said, if you put a piece of bread on the counter, it doesn't go up in flames, it doesn't burn. But when we eat it, even though our bodies are not, you know, extremely hot, it ultimately does burn. And so, we had to understand how enzymes
mm,
happen. And Warburg used a lot of really brilliant indirect methods to figure it out because he couldn't, use the tools that we have today, which would have just, made it visible in a sense.
right. Can you also explain, because again, this sequentially will lead to what, the whole idea with his influence in his work on cancer, what the Warburg effect was?
Sure, sure. So, the Warburg effect, that's, the reason I wrote about Warburg ultimately is because of this discovery that he makes in the early 20s, where he sees that cancer cells are taking up a lot of glucose, much more than normal cells. And instead of burning it with oxygen in the mitochondria, that's respiration, that's the reason we breathe, cellular respiration. Instead, they were using, what I use the analogy of a backup generator. They were fermenting the glucose instead of burning it with oxygen, just doing the same thing that microorganisms do, yeast and so on, just, splitting the glucose apart and, basically taking it out of the cell in the form of lactic acid. Some microorganisms do that. That's how we get yogurt. Other ones use a very similar process and we get alcohol. And so we get beer and bread and wine, and wine and so many other foods. So it was understood by the 1920s that a cell could do this. Warburg wasn't the first to discover that human cells also could ferment. But it was thought to be that something a cell only would do in desperation. And what Warburg saw is that cancer cells, they had access to oxygen, and yet they still seem to prefer this fermentation method, taking up a lot of glucose and breaking it down and turning it into lactic acid. So that became known as the Warburg effect. Whereas, instead of doing it out of desperation, you can think of it in terms of when somebody exercises, they do intense sprinting and their lungs can't keep up. We produce lactic acid as part of the process that makes our muscles sore. That's a case where we need to turn to fermentation to keep up with the energy demand.
Right.
But Warburg saw, cancer cells weren't under that kind of stress and they were still doing it. So that was the mystery. Why are cancer cells doing this? What causes them to do it? Because Warburg thought this is the most fundamental step in cancer, this metabolic shift. And if we could figure this out, we could figure cancer out.
Did he ever really come close to figuring it out? Like, what was his theory on cancer? I'm not.
Yeah. Well, he certainly thought he did. Not long after he made the discovery, he proposed a hypothesis to explain it, and he stuck by that his whole life. I
Right.
said before, he couldn't admit he was wrong about anything, and I think that's what ultimately tripped him up. I think he made the right discovery. I mean, he made a huge discovery. He simultaneously recognized that discovery is very fundamental and important, but I don't think he was necessarily right about why it happens. And, unfortunately, that got him involved in all sorts of controversy. So his hypothesis in the end, he sort of developed it over time. But his basic hypothesis is that if there's oxygen there and it's not being used to produce energy, then there must be some kind of defect. Something is poisoning the mitochondria, poisoning the cell, and forcing it to turn to fermentation, like turning on the backup generator because there's some kind of problem. Clearly there's oxygen, but if a cell could use oxygen, it would. So something's going wrong. And he ultimately concluded that it was environmental causes. And, he was particularly concerned about chemicals in the environment.
Right. I know you mentioned that.
Yeah, he thought they basically poison the cell and force it to turn to fermentation, and that pushes us towards cancer. I came away thinking, that may be the case for some cancers. I came away thinking that that's not the deeper story, that Warburg was largely wrong about that. And it gets really messy because it is true that as cancer progresses, they have a harder time getting oxygen. The blood vessel supply is narrowed, et cetera, and they do ferment more to make up for that. So he was very close, but I think the deeper origin of the story is diet, but not in the way he thought. He thought it was diet poisoning the cell with chemicals. I came to the conclusion it was probably. Should I wait to get to that?
No, it's okay. Yeah, it's interesting because I wanted to get to his perspective on diet before we get to a little bit more modern stuff, because he was concerned, as you mentioned, about all the artificial ingredients in foods, even in the 30s and 40s. God knows, compared to today, he would pass out,
Yeah.
But he was concerned about that. I believe you mentioned in the book. I don't remember if he followed a specific diet. I don't think he was vegetarian, but he was very particular about, like, even I think where his milk came from or any of his products, as much homegrown as possible. I
Yeah.
mean, what was his theory a little bit on diet? Did he have? I don't recall. There was, I mean, today we have so many things: paleo, keto, vegetarian, and I don't. Did he have like for his own personal view? What did he,
Yeah, I mean, I would call it sort of an extreme organic diet.
hmm
He was really at the forefront of the organic diet movement. He is probably most known in America through the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, who, talks so much about the environmental carcinogens. And she actually, when she talks about cancer, Warburg is the first scientist she cites. And a lot of people have forgotten about that, but that had a big influence. So that's the realm that he's in. He's very interested in chemicals, and and that's still a big story, but even more so in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that was becoming a bigger and bigger story, environmental poisons. So that's what he really was interested in. So it wasn't about meat or protein or carbs, it was about contamination. And he that was that also shows his German influence. That's what I talk about in the book too, that, throughout the 20th century, the Germans had this obsession with, impurities, and that was part of the Nazi ideology, but
Mm,
beyond Nazi ideology, to thinking about contamination and all sorts. And, what makes it so complicated is, despite the overlaps with some of the Nazi ideology, I mean, there are genuine concerns about chemicals in food. Not everything
yeah,
is wrong just because it's has a disturbing parallel to some ideology.
right.
I think he deserves credit in some respects for drawing more attention to these issues, and he would write letters to the government and newspapers about smog and air pollution and things of that nature. And this poor partner, Jakob Heiss, had to like make all this food from scratch.
Yeah, there was the horse and the boss. He was the boss. The other guy was the horse. The
Yeah,
horse.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that was his worldview, and
It was
I
interesting too. Like also you mentioned, I found it interesting. All even these little details, like wherever he had his institute, he always had like some kind of view of a garden. I guess he was very interested in nature, and I guess
yeah,
like a lot of holistic people feel like getting back to nature in some ways, gets you away from this sterile, artificial environment that's probably not good for our health. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well.
yeah, and he was an aristocrat. He
Yes.
liked fancy things. He had
Oh yeah.
antique
Hmm.
furniture and this
Yeah.
gorgeous institute that was modeled after an 18th century country manor.
Hmm.
And he would like to look out at the garden. I think that ultimately played into his views of cancer. He saw respiration with oxygen as being above fermentation like coming in his view earlier in evolution, and being the lower microorganisms and evolved animals having respiration. So in his sort of hierarchical worldview, fermentation was bad, respiration was good, and cancer had to be caused by the bad thing.
Interesting. Okay, let's make a transition to modern science on cancer. And there are obviously a lot of important things. When I look at the overview, what we'll talk about there's genetics, there's immunology, and then full circle back to metabolism. Now, up to the 1950s, it was interesting. Chemists and biochemists were considered the leaders in cancer research. It was very prestigious to be a chemist. Um, then in 1953, Watson and Crick discovered the structure of the double helix of DNA. And as you mentioned, a lot wasn't done right then, but I think a lot of people saw the potential there that, again, of what it potentially could happen. And it opened up the whole field of genetics and actually, obviously, the search, for genetic links to cancer. And as you mentioned, in the 1970s, the first oncogene was discovered by doctors Michael Bishop, and Harold Varmus. Harold Varmus went on to be the NIH director. And then, so this became the focus for a while. Cancer, uh, genes causing cancer became the focus, and the metabolic origins of cancer kind of fell by the wayside. Now,
Yeah,
even more recently, which all of us can see on television all the time, immunology is now starting to dominate the whole field of oncology. Like Dr. Allison's work, James Allison's
yeah,
work in Texas, on T cells and CAR therapy. Let's use the immune system. They're the Pac-Man to figure out how to kill these cancer cells. So again, now it's like we went from the DNA and the genetic mutations to now our surveillance system. Maybe that can take care of it. And then you mentioned in the book, because that's what we're going to focus on, that in around 2010, there was sort of this revival of Warburg's work on metabolic theory of cancer. Um, So maybe you could tell us a little bit about Craig Thompson's work at University of Pennsylvania, about why he got it interested again, and they start to think like, wait, maybe we better go back to this Warburg guy stuff, about cancer and glucose and diet and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. So, as you mentioned, in the post-war period, Warburg's work just completely disappeared. It's really amazing how quickly it fell out of favor within the cancer world. By the 1970s, people just aren't interested. Partially because Warburg made such extreme claims, and
Hmm.
partially science paradigms, as you mentioned, just sort of naturally shift, and partially because Warburg's hypothesis wasn't well supported by some of the studies that tried to reproduce his effect.
He never did any clinical trials, though, right? I mean, again, he was a doctor, even though he was. I mean, I know he went to medical school.
Laboratory
It was
experiments.
all labs,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, I should clarify that his fundamental finding that cancer cells turn to fermentation held up very well. What didn't hold up is Warburg said that that the use of oxygen was going down, and others studies said, well, these cancer cells are still using oxygen, so it doesn't have to be this either or thing. But in any case, in the 1970s, as you mentioned, they start to find oncogenes, and that takes over. And I heard stories literally of like these Warburg respiration devices being thrown into the garbage, and the posters coming off the wall. Just a very dramatic paradigm shift. And so these new scientists like Craig Thompson was at the forefront of this. They're getting their degrees, and all the excitement is around genetics and figuring out which mutations cause cancer. They called Warburg's enzymes housekeeping enzymes. They understood, cell at some level needs nutrients or it's going
Right.
to die. But it seemed to be peripheral to the real story. The real story, the cool stuff, as Craig Thompson said, was the genetics. So they're trying to understand how a gene controls a cell's ability to sort of escape the regulation of the body and keep making copies of itself, and basically tracing the mutation to what protein signals it sends these pathways through the cell. And as they're tracing them, they start finding that it turns out that the many of the key mutations that are associated with cancer actually control metabolism. So it was kind of this
Mm.
circular path back to Warburg.
Hmm.
And now, a way to think about it is that, oncogenes are a real important thing, but, the same oncogenes that changed our understanding of cancer also are, the key sort of pieces that control metabolism. And so Craig Thompson specifically focused on an enzyme named called AKT, and some people have referred to it as the Warburg enzyme, because when it's mutated, when it's sort of flipped on, it's in hyperactive mode. What it does is it starts pulling more and more glucose into the cell, and then as that glucose floods in, the cell turns to fermentation to sort of manage this, and it starts to switch on this sort of this cancer metabolism. So that was sort of the marriage of these two different worlds. Another very important scientist at the forefront of this was Chi Van Dang, who was working on a transcription factor, one of these genes that turns on many other genes and sort of has a huge impact on the cell. And it was called MYC. And sure enough, that like played a fundamental role in turning on fermentation as well. So it all sort of came together, and there was this excitement, a revival about metabolism, and could we starve a cancer cell by targeting one of these mutations, depriving it of the nutrients that it needs. And that is ongoing research. I think it's pretty exciting, but it's like with everything in cancer, there's a lot of excitement, and then it doesn't always pan out, and takes time. So what I think is that the real excitement about metabolism is the prevention story, what it tells us about cancer prevention. And what worries me is, I'm excited about the immuno stuff, the immunometabolism research, and all sorts of stuff. But I feel like in some ways we might be repeating the mistakes of the past, moving on to the next thing while missing this sort of fundamental lesson about prevention. And I think Warburg was right that metabolism is at the core of cancer, and that if we think about that in the context of prevention, it has huge implications for our diet.
Yeah. You're making me think about something as we're talking now. It's very interesting that metabolism and diet, and we're going to get to my next question on something important with this, is how you get it early. The immunology to me now makes sense, is like the last stab at getting the immune system back in regulation. Because once, I mean, I would think at one point, I mean, whatever your diet is, if you have stage 3 or 4 cancer, that's not going to do it. I mean, I'm also eating well now, and whatever, even a restricted or fasting diet, we'll get into that too, how that can help. It might be too late. I mean, the cells have been dysregulated, they're
Yeah.
metastasizing. You might need your super surveillance system, the immune system, to go in and clean up if it's
Yeah.
possible. But if you could avoid getting to that stage by dealing with the underlying metabolism issue, again, going back to the data that showed that, obviously, and again, sometimes it's always hard to know, were we seeing higher cancer statistics because they were diagnosing cancer better compared to, who knows, the 1700s or 1800s, or was it truly increasing, because of modern society, diet, chemicals, additives, et cetera, environmental toxins. I want to ask you also, you mentioned about the researcher Lewis Cantley,
Mhm.
who made the connection between insulin levels. I thought this was really fascinating, and cancer. And he championed, as you mentioned in the book, I want to try to keep this as simple as I can for the listeners, that insulin stimulated something called the P, is it I3K pathway?
Yeah, PI3K. And
Yeah, pathway that actually causes increased nutrients in the cells. And you pointed out in the book from the research that tumors actually have increased number of insulin receptors on them. Why was this important?
yeah. So this really is the end of the book. The beginning of the book is cancer is increasing. The end of the book is Cantley's research. He probably influenced me more than almost any other cancer scientist. And and this goes back to what you were just talking about. Was cancer really on the increase? Was it just more diagnosis, people living longer lives? So I devoted a whole chapter to that because, in a way, if you don't, it's controversial, but if you don't buy that it was truly increasing, then it undermines a lot of the arguments of my book. So I think the evidence is very strong that it's increasing and
It
that
does seem to be the case. Yeah.
I mean, you don't even have to look at the early stuff because you
Right.
just see like these migration, these migratory populations where they go from one country to another. And
Yes, right, right. Of course, when the Japanese, they come to the United States, all of a sudden their heart disease and cancer rates start going up
yeah, and
tremendously. Yeah,
that doesn't prove it's any one element of the diet, but it's something about the way we live.
something's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I don't even think that's controversial. What's controversial is some people put the estimate as low as 40%. Some people put it as high as 90% in terms of the environmental causes of cancer. Clearly, some are genetic. Clearly, some are bad luck. But clearly, I think a very large part of it is something in our environment. Anyways, so my hypothesis, or the one that I explore, which again is controversial, is that cancer was quite rare. Not, I shouldn't say rare. It's always been around, but compared to today, it was quite
right.
rare prior to the 18th century, really. And then you see in the 19th century becomes more and more common, and then vastly more common in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. And so the mystery is, what's going on, what's causing this. And my hypothesis is that, the key to it is that the metabolic dysfunction, what this condition, which we now sometimes call the metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance, was developing around that time as we transitioned to diets that were high in sugar and refined carbs. And what that would do, among other things, is give your body more insulin, more of this hormone, which can function very much like a growth factor. Um, giving your cells the message to take up more glucose, just as would happen in the Warburg effect. And so Cantley, looked at all this through the lens of modern science and was able to show that that cancer cells are covered in insulin receptors, as you pointed out, and that this pathway that he discovered, PI3K, turns out to be the most most commonly mutated pathway in cancer. So there's tons of evidence, that cancer cells are responsive to insulin. They use that to sort of flip on the Warburg effect and have a growth advantage over other cells. So, just to kind of summarize all of this, the sort of one of the leading hypotheses is that, these mutations might crop up all the time, microscopic tumors that are wiped out by the immune system. But if, this crops up and you have an ability to take up a little more insulin and a body that is flowing with extra insulin, those cells will have a little bit of an advantage. They'll be less likely to go through this process of cell suicide. It's sort of like a survival signal.
Right.
And as they continue, to grow, that insulin, gives them an advantage. So, that's what sort of Cantley brought me to. And I think that explains both why the Warburg effect happens or links to the Warburg effect, and also explains why cancer became more common, because we all started to have this metabolic dysfunction. I mentioned early in this interview that I had high triglycerides. What I didn't know at the time is that that's actually a sign of insulin resistance. I had it myself. A lot of people think it's just obesity, but
No, it's right. It's also driven by, people don't realize, because it's also from, like, when, just for example, drinking alcohol, but any simple carbohydrate actually pushes up your triglycerides. People think, fat makes you fat, or fat makes you have high triglycerides, or cholesterol, but sugar even more so. So,
yeah,
and I think one of the takeaways, which we'll get back to later on, is that unfortunately sugar is, in a sense, I hate to use the word, but it's like the enemy. I mean, because the consumption has gone up so much. Even Linus Pauling, who I loved his work. I mean, he was a Nobel Prize winner in physics, but he ended up later on in his life turning a lot to functional medicine, and he was really beaten up for that. Like, where did he, like, the guy was really the original biochemist. I mean, if anybody knew all the pathways in the body, he knew them. And he's he wrote a lot about vitamins and stuff like that too, which again he was ridiculed for. But one of the things I remember in his books was that sugar consumption is a huge problem. And and I think a lot of things in your book kind of bore that out. I
yeah,
find what is also very interesting too. You mentioned, I'd heard about it before, but in the 1990s there was a remote village in Ecuador that researchers found a community of dwarfs who seemed to be immune to cancer despite a poor diet and lifestyle. And it was called Larone Syndrome. I'm not sure if it was maybe named after the researcher. Could you tell us a little bit about that, or the population?
yeah. I haven't looked at that information in a while. You read the book more
Okay.
recently than I have, but
Okay.
basically, there's two key hormones. There's insulin and a very closely related hormone, IGF-1, and they sort of
Hmm.
work together in response to our diets to manage growth. And IGF-1, works with growth hormone. So if you have a damaged IGF-1 receptor, then you're not going to be able to grow very tall. That's why they're dwarfs.
Right.
And what's surprising is that without this ability, they also seem to be I don't know, totally immune, but largely immune to cancer. So it just shows that how fundamental insulin and insulin like growth factor are to cancer. It's just one piece of many pieces of evidence, but it's so interesting to me that this is, I feel like it's kind of staring us all in the face that we have all this epidemiological data showing higher insulin, more cancer, linking diabetes to cancer, linking elevated glucose to cancer. And yet, despite all that, it remains controversial to say that sugar is somehow linked to cancer. But you don't have to make much of a leap. All you have to do is see the clear science linking sugar and refined carbs to poor metabolic health and higher insulin, and then from there the higher insulin to cancer. We still need more research, but some of the stuff is really striking when when you're just growing cancer cells in a lab dish and petri dish. You actually, for many cancers, you actually need the insulin to even grow them. If you wean them off insulin, they start to die. Not for all cancers, but for some, and not every cancer, of course, relies on this insulin PI3K pathway. And I don't want to say this is everything, but it's such a fundamental part that I think it is overlooked, and that's what surprising to me, because one scientist, Michael Pollack, who's one of the leading cancer scientists in Canada, who focuses on insulin and sugar as well. And I said to him, why is it so controversial? We talk about sex hormones in cancer and estrogen, and
Hmm.
that's not controversial. And, this is also a hormonal cancer story in the
Right.
sense that, he's mystified by it as well, I think. But anytime diet comes into the conversation, it immediately becomes controversial because there's such a long history of quackery and diet stuff. And I get that, but we have to be able to see both at the same time. We have to be able to see that, yes, there's a lot of diet related nonsense, and yes, like diet is clearly fundamentally related to many types, and it happens to be the most common and deadly types of cancer, all the ones that have been linked to obesity. The link is often said that obesity causes cancer. I actually think that's misleading. I think it's the underlying insulin that's driving both obesity and cancer simultaneously. And there are some striking parallels between how the adipose tissue sort of takes up nutrients and hogs them in the way that cancer cells do.
What I find though a little bit confusing is that I think most of the listeners know there's a difference between type 1 diabetes, which we call insulin dependent. These are patients that, for some reason the pancreas did not produce enough insulin, so they need supplementation, through injections, pumps, etc. And then we have the type 2 diabetes, which again probably goes a little more with your insulin resistance. They have actually too much insulin, but it's not working, the receptors on the cells, and those patients tend to gain weight and get other medical issues. But I think from what you're saying and some of the data, it seems like it's mostly the type 2 diabetes who have a lot of this insulin floating around would be more prone to getting cancers versus I think patients who've been, type 1 diabetics, do they have an increased risk of cancer? Because essentially they have less insulin, but they're being supplemented. Are you aware of
Yeah,
anything with
yeah,
that?
yeah. No, I'm only talking about type 2, and I
It's only
should.
type 2. Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing I would want is, to give the message that,
Right, right,
type 1 diabetics need insulin to survive. Everybody needs insulin to survive.
right, right,
The concern is only when you have, this condition of hyperinsulinemia, when you have much more insulin than you normally would under metabolic health. And in the last stages of type 2 diabetes, it truly can resemble type 1, sort of the pancreas sort of
right,
burns out, and you end up
right,
actually really needing, the insulin or other treatments. But in the first stages of diabetes, they're almost opposite conditions. One case you can't make insulin, the other case you have too much insulin.
right.
Your
Hmm.
cells aren't responding to it. And that's caused so much confusion. And I think the deeper story is, what we call diabetes is really the last stage of diabetes. But the deeper story is really so many of us, most of us, the vast majority of American adults who aren't diagnosed with diabetes actually have already the first stages of diabetes, the first stages of insulin resistance.
Yeah,
I don't know if I still do. I certainly did at one point. Gerald Schulman at Yale is a leading insulin
I've heard of him.
researcher, and yeah, he does a lot of his testing on Yale undergraduates. He said most of them already come in with insulin resistance. It's by one measure, 88% of American adults have some degree of insulin resistance. So if this really is, a key risk factor for cancer, then it's really all of us, which could explain why cancer is so
Yeah,
ubiquitous.
yeah. One last area I wanted to just talk about before we kind of wrap up. You talk about the dangers of sugar and the fructose versus the glucose story, and you call fructose the evil twin or doppelganger. I learned a little more definition of doppelganger. I thought it was just a lookalike, but actually, apparently, you informed me that it actually means the evil twin. So when you see somebody that
Yeah,
looks like you, be careful
yeah.
calling them a doppelganger. What would you say are the main points to understand about the fructose versus the glucose? I mean, obviously, fructose is in fruit. Glucose is in any, it's a part of, when carbohydrates are broken down, right? So,
Yeah,
what
yeah,
should we know about this?
yeah. I think sugar is the number one concern. When I say sugar, it's very confusing because we have all these different terms.
Right,
I mean sucrose. I mean the sweet white stuff. I don't mean glucose, which is also sometimes referred to as sugar. Our blood sugar,
right,
call it blood sugar, but it's actually, glucose. What I think the number one issue is sucrose, the sweet white stuff, half fructose, half glucose. And I say that because, there are societies that have had good metabolic health that have eaten a ton of glucose, maybe not refined glucose. So maybe it's the refined carbs and sugar, but, certainly Asian societies that were doing very well on unrefined
You're
carbs.
talking about like rice, like
Yeah,
because remember here, like some of these things are taboo, because again, they know that it affects what's called the glycemic index, your body's
yeah, yeah,
response, but people try to refine what people understand about that is called the glycemic load, because sometimes
yeah,
a fruit with fiber and water, you know, won't necessarily make your glycemic index go up very
yeah.
quickly. So
Yeah, but and also, the unrefined rice and what, they may have been eating it, rice that never eating white rice, for example. But the real story, I think, and this is in a lot of ways, I'm parroting Gary Taubes here. He
yes, hmm
influenced me a lot, but that he uses the expression that sugar is always at the scene of the crime. There are societies that have eaten carbs, that have eaten fruits in various forms, but we pretty much have no society that's eaten sugar, refined sugar in large amounts that has not developed these metabolic conditions. And we see it every time. They start eating a lot of sugar and white flour comes in, and then in a matter of years or decades, they start having all the same problems that everybody else has. And in the 19th century, they had these remote populations that weren't eating this way. And then, some of these doctors would stay with them for decades, and then all these problems would arise. You see it remarkably in these populations of Yemenites that came to Israel. One generation after the next, they become healthy, and 30 years later, living in Israel, they develop all these metabolic problems. And it's always sugar is always at the scene of the crime. So why sugar? And it seems to be that fructose first and foremost. That glucose alone isn't good for it will spike your blood sugar, but fructose has unique metabolic properties that basically allow it to generate fat stores. The liver quickly will can turn some of it into fat, and as the liver and starts to accumulate more fat, it'll start looking for a place to send it to the adipose tissue, send it, ultimately it'll end up in the muscles, and it starts causing this process of insulin resistance. Like it's the mechanism. Gerald Schulman, who I was just talking about studies, is the mechanisms of what actually causes it to happen are debated, but this extra fat, this internal fat around our internal organs, seems to be the very key fundamental step. Once we have that cell, you have all this glucose in your system, and the cell doesn't have a way to get it out of the blood. The cells aren't responding to the insulin, and the pancreas responds to that by producing even more insulin.
yeah.
And then you have the condition we talked about, hyperinsulinemia, and I think that's a very serious risk factor for cancer.
Yeah. You know what I find fascinating? It was again today, I was looking at, I like to read the New York Times every day, and I read the obituaries, not for morbid reason, because I think they're amazing biographies of
Yeah,
people's
no,
lives.
yeah, I agree.
And one of the things that always seems to strike me, because even today in the New York Times, there was an obituary on someone who was a Holocaust survivor, and he lived into his 90s. And it always strikes me like here's somebody who's survived one of the most horrible things you could imagine in life. Yet I do frequently see the people that survived the Holocaust, the concentration camps, etc. A lot of them went on to live very long lives, and I find it fascinating because I just always wonder, was it the food restriction during those years and maybe later on that gave them longevity? I mean, that was the best, revenge against Hitler, I think, living a long, good
Yeah,
quality life.
yeah.
But what would you say? Again, I don't think you're not here to give medical advice, but some of your takeaways about cancer and diet, if you had to summarize a few things that, people should
Yeah.
think about.
Yeah, what I say is, there are no guarantees with cancer. Diet isn't going to guarantee you, and certainly
Right,
if you have cancer, it's not going to cure it. Although there is some really exciting research going on with diet as an adjuvant therapy,
right.
which it's too soon to say, but it's exciting to see what's going on. But to me, the takeaway advice is if you're insulin resistant, as most of us are, try to correct that to, I think it's analogous to quitting smoking. It's like, it's a serious risk factor for cancer. I think the evidence is quite strong. So how do you correct that to give yourself better odds? I mean, I would say step one is don't drink any sugar. I think, because
Yeah.
drinking sugar, seems to cause insulin resistance the fastest. Step two would be just, eliminating as much sugar as you can. The next step would be focusing on the refined carbs. It may be true that if you never ate any sugar, you could eat a lot of carbs and be okay. But what's clear is that once you already have the insulin resistance, cutting the sugar alone isn't going to be enough. You got to get the refined carbs out of your diet. And some people, everybody has different sensitivities. Some people need to restrict all carbs. Some people, just need to.
Interesting.
Some people go all the way to carnivore. There's a huge range.
Yeah, there is a huge range, and obviously, I've had a lot of people on the podcast, experts who've talked to. Every one of them is convinced their method is right, from Walter Longo to Barry Sears. I've had the whole range, Dean Ornish, you name it, and everyone after I get off the podcast, I'm convinced, oh, they're right. They're all very good at.
What I would say is, in a way, they all are right, but what they almost always have in common some degree of carbohydrate restriction.
Yeah, except Dean Ornish, but I mean to some degree, but
yeah, but think about, sorry, it's the issue that I debate and think about, but the
yeah.
diet, yeah, it's carbohydrates, but they're not refined carbohydrates.
No, he does. He says that like complex. You're right. And I think the other really big thing, honestly, too, is movement. Unfortunately, in our society now, we're all in front of computers more than ever. Sitting, I found myself, I just got a standing desk because I'm like, I realize people I think that are standing do better than sitting all day long. Anyway, Sam, this has been a wonderful conversation. Your book, Ravenous, I highly recommend to all of our listeners. The Otto Warburg story, the Nazis and the search for the cancer diet connection. Where can our listeners find out more about your writing and what you're up to?
I have a website, samapple.com. I'm not sure how much it will inform people, but I'm active on Twitter at Sam_Apple1. So
are you working on another book, or are you going to take a break for a little while? How long did this take? Did this take a couple of years to write?
Took the first year I was working on a magazine article. I published that, and then I got the book deal, and took 5 more years after that.
Wow.
So really 6 years. I'm kind of taking a break, focusing on teaching mostly, but doing little projects here and there.
Okay. Again, thank you so much. I hope all our listeners enjoy this. If you have, please leave a review on my Instagram site, The Smartest Doctor in the Room, and hopefully we'll bring you some more terrific guests like today's.